I'm happy to have been invited by Washtenaw Families Against Narcotics to talk with you about an important topic that is about everyone who cares about addressing substance misuse and about supporting recovery. Junkie, stoner, pothead, crackhead, tweaker. So what do these words immediately bring to mind for you? Think about what images they create for you and what opinions you might have about a person that these words are labeled to. So you may never have used these labels personally or professionally, but how about what's on the next slide? Addict, alcoholic, drug abuser, user, drug seeker. Maybe you've been more likely to use these labels in your work and in your personal life. So through this presentation, you're going to be encouraged to say goodbye to using these labels. And this is why. The words we use convey meaning. They communicate attitudes, beliefs, understanding, misconceptions, biases, stereotypes, history, and customs. Several research studies have experimentally compared perceptions and stereotypes formed by the use of different words, like describing a person as having a substance use disorder versus being a substance abuser. The result, consistently, is that substance abuser description leads members of the general public to view the vignette characters as a greater social threat, more blameworthy, less likely to benefit from treatment, and more likely to benefit from punishment. Even among highly trained mental health professionals, the substance abuser label evoked a significantly more blameworthy, more agreement that punitive measures should be taken, such as being given a jail sentence as a wake-up call, and a greater tendency to recommend moral rather than medical intervention. The conclusion from these research studies is clear. It matters very much how we refer to individuals who are experiencing a substance-related concern, and that a worthwhile goal is to use language with great care. Posted on a website called Broken No More is a statement that stigma is driven by the words we use. And to decrease stigma, we should start with our words. One problem with labeling people in this manner is that it tends to melt away a person's uniqueness and individuality. The label becomes who the person is, rather than describing just one aspect of what makes up a complex individual. Labels tend to depersonalize. When we apply a label like addict or alcoholic, the person becomes categorized that way. It becomes their identity. And we ignore the rest of who that person is. And we make assumptions about them based on the category to which they've been assigned. Another problem with labels is that when we put someone into a labeled category, we expect them to stay put. We draw conclusions about the likelihood that they can really ever change. Once labeled an addict or an alcoholic or other term, we expect them to always fit that label, regardless of any changes that they do accomplish. At best, maybe they can become an ex-addict or a former addict, but they're still identified with addiction being their central defining trait. We believe that leopards don't change their spots. And this establishes a really hopeless point of view, one that's inaccurate as well. There exists plenty of evidence that people do change and that recovery does happen. Yet another problem with applying labels to people who engage in substance misuse is that it creates social and psychological distance. Distancing meant to make the person applying the label a little more comfortable. Labeling people establishes a them versus us mentality. It emphasizes how those people are different from us and how they are not like me. Labels separate us and emphasize our differences rather than how we are alike. Intentional or unintentional messages conveyed through labels categorize the labeled person as separate from others and from ourselves. Not like me is at the very root of stigma. Sometimes the language we use about substance misuse implies that a person is to blame for causing their own problems and for problems they may have caused others. The social function of blame is to punish and shame. This is a far cry from helping a person assume responsibility for engaging in addictive behaviors. In relation to the development of self-concept, the renowned child development scholar Yuri Bronfenbrenner stated, "The outside becomes the inside." In other words, explicit and implicit messages are internalized. This is at the root of toxic self-stigma. Self-stigma refers to internalizing stigmatizing beliefs and applying them to oneself. Considerable evidence demonstrates that individuals who experience substance use disorders are subject to a great deal of both public and self-stigma, which in turn is associated with lower self-esteem, higher depression and anxiety, and more sleep problems. Looking at the impact of toxic shame and self-stigma, consider an exchange I once had with a woman preparing to re-enter the community after serving a sentence for drug-related offenses. She was literally, physically hanging her head in shame, blaming and berating herself for the mistakes she made with her children during the period when she was using drugs. I quietly interrupted her with a simple question. Do you learn from your mistakes? She stopped and stared at me. She asked, what do you mean? I repeated the question. Do you learn from your mistakes? After a long pause, while she considered my question, her whole posture straightened up. She lifted her head, she looked me in the eye, nodded, and said, yes, I guess I do. And that was all it took. She accepted responsibility for becoming a better mother. Blame and shame left her no solutions for moving forward. She could not undo the past, but seeing herself as someone who learns from past mistakes showed her what she could do moving forward. The new outside message became the new inside. Blame and shame messaging damages the heart, soul, self-concept, and self-identity of the person who's the target of these messages. Shame and embarrassment over their substance use is frequently reported by individuals experiencing a substance use disorder, promoting secrecy about their behavior and acting as a barrier to engaging with recovery support services. A majority of participants in one primary care study who experienced a substance use disorder reported believing that they have permanently screwed up their lives. They felt ashamed and felt out of place in the world as a result of their substance misuse. A person who comes to believe themselves to be hopeless, helpless, unworthy, unlovable, bad, weak, lazy, useless, defective, and otherwise no good becomes boxed in by toxic self-blame, self-shame, self-doubt, and self-stigma. So how does this boxed in person respond? They disappear, they withdraw, they escape, go away and hide. This is not fruitful for engaging the person in substance-related change or recovery efforts. In fact, toxic self-stigma is one of the main reasons why individuals experiencing problems associated with substance misuse might avoid seeking healthcare, harm reduction, and other services. They also may withdraw from services prematurely, thereby diminishing their recovery outcomes. Unfortunately, there exists considerable evidence that feeling disparaged by others and experiencing external and internalized stigma have a deterrent effect on substance-related help-seeking behavior. Not only is this true in relation to stigma toward persons who engage in substance misuse, it's also true in relation to stigma and perceived risks associated with seeking help. Additionally, there exists evidence that individuals who perceived stigma from healthcare and other service providers were less likely to complete treatment for substance-related concerns. So what exactly is stigma? These are some simple dictionary definitions. A mark of disgrace or infamy, a mark of shame or discredit, some kind of a blemish, a strong feeling of disapproval that most people in society have about something, especially when it's unfair. Well, stigma comes in different forms. It may originate from the general community in which a person functions, from professionals with whom a person might interact, and from within as self-stigma. A person's experiences and behaviors may be affected by either actual or perceived stigma, or even by anticipation of encountering stigma. This more detailed definition of stigma concerns all the levels of society where stigma occurs, from macro-level social policy systems and institutions to communities, families, and individuals. This definition also addresses implications. Stigma manifests in behavior, social structures, policy, and other discriminatory practices, what we tend to call explicit bias. Explicit bias towards individuals experiencing substance use disorders impacts their housing and food security, employment and income stability, social and healthcare services, and entanglement with criminal justice, child welfare, and legal systems. And those are just examples. Implicit bias, on the other hand, is about subconscious beliefs and attitudes. These beliefs may influence our behavior in unintentional ways, ways that interfere with our social interactions and engaging with one another. In terms of clinical practice, implicit bias impedes the formation of therapeutic alliance, what we call a working relationship. Researchers exploring implicit bias concluded that terms like addict should no longer be used in professional or lay settings because of the implicit bias evoked by such terms. Stigma marginalizes members of a population. These individuals become systematically excluded, discounted, less enfranchised in society, and categorized as less desirable human beings. In some cases, they're rendered invisible. The inherent dignity of a person is lost, turning a whole and usual person to a tainted and discounted one. Through repeated experiences of stigma, a person develops what the sociologist Irving Goffman calls a spoiled identity, where someone feels tainted and experiences a wholesale rejection of their identity. Loss of self-respect and believing you're unworthy can result in the why try phenomenon as it relates to seeking help or otherwise engaging in recovery efforts. Simply anticipating that stigma will be encountered in future interactions inhibits a person's willingness to risk the stress of yet another anticipated stigma experience. Evidence indicates that individuals experiencing substance use disorders encounter a remarkably high number of stigmatizing experiences, and these experiences may act as personal and systematic barriers for help seeking and recovery process. In a study conducted in 2000-2001, so it's a little bit older, across 16 nations, drug addiction received the highest levels of disapproval, and alcoholism was fourth. And this is out of 18 health and social conditions. HI positivity was second, and having a criminal record for burglary was third. And it's not uncommon for these all four to come together. Evidence that substance use related stigma impedes access to, engagement in, and retention in treatment and recovery support services, as well as self-efficacy for change, is growing. The evidence concerning how stigma relates to recovery outcomes is a little more mixed. Some research indicates that outcomes are worse when stigma is high. Other studies indicate that recovery outcomes can improve even though stigma may not change. Stigma does seem to be more extreme when substance misuse is more severe. A public opinion study conducted in the United States reported that 59% of people in the general public believed treatment options for persons with drug addictions are ineffective, and 28% rejected the concept that persons with drug addiction could get well with treatment and return to productive lives. Toxic stereotypes of persons experiencing substance use disorder revolve around perceptions of dangerousness and unpredictability, capability for making their own decisions about treatment and other life decisions, blame or responsibility for their substance-related problems, and treatment prognosis. One aspect of public stigma that may need challenging arises when others who may have engaged in substance use or misuse themselves fail to understand the difference between their experience and the experiences of a person whose substance use has become disordered. All of this translates into lower public support for policies to support this population and recovery services. Thus, public stigma and structural stigma become intertwined phenomena. Compounding the picture, consider what happens when different stigma collide, the intersection or interplay among different stigma-related factors. A systematic literature review concluded that ethnic minorities, youth, men, and those in military and health professions were disproportionately deterred by stigma, deterred from help seeking by stigma. Another review concluded that stigma barriers to substance-related treatment were compounded for individuals who were older, a member of a racial or ethnic minority group, diagnosed with co-occurring depression, or tested positive for HIV infection, and that women faced additional stigma, especially when pregnant, incarcerated, Black, or facing child custody concerns. One study demonstrated that among individuals experiencing unmet substance use treatment needs, women were more likely to report stigma as a barrier to treatment than were men, and regardless of gender, parents reported the highest levels of stigma. Evidence abounds that individuals who identify as a gender or sexual minority underutilize services to address substance-related concerns to an even greater extent than their peers. And this contributes to treatment delays and more serious problems developing. Another study identified the stigma of addiction as a key theme influencing a lack of trust in healthcare systems, particularly held by women experiencing substance use disorders. The intersectionality here is related to the very high rate of trauma these women have experienced, which in turn potentially affects their levels of trust and formation of interpersonal relationships that are fundamental to recovery support services. Or consider the interplay between stigma experienced by women who've been incarcerated for substance-related offenses. Let's turn our attention for a moment to stigma as experienced by family members. All too often, families share a person's stigma. This phenomenon is sometimes referred to as courtesy stigma or associative stigma. Family members often endure hearing other people talk in derogatory ways or make insensitive jokes about the people they love, or they find that others diagnose them as being codependent or as enablers. Two highly stigmatizing labels, poorly supported by a questionable evidence base. What we previously explored in relation to individuals' toxic self-stigma extends to family members as well. They too may be subjected to a loss of respect, as well as blame, shame, pity, criticism, unwelcome advice, or suspicion that they're contaminated in some way. Extended family members may express to the immediate family members that it didn't come from our side of the family, or if it was my kid, or maybe your partner or parent, I would ... fill in the blank with some kind of advice. An Australian study concerning family members' experiences of stigma described how family members all too often are referred to in unsympathetic and derogatory ways as possessing character defects and having codependent relationships that perpetuate or enable the person's substance misuse. Not only do family members experience public stigma, they assume aspects of self-stigma and self-blame. In reaction, family members may become cut off from extended family and friends, engage in secrecy, and minimize contact with others in their social network who show a lack of knowledge and empathy and express judgmental attitudes. Participants in one study described the many ways they tried to avoid stigma situations and hide their family situation. This extends their sense of isolation. They may be hesitant to seek help because of their own experiences with toxic stigma. One family member described the experience as feeling like a pariah. Healthcare and service providers need to make themselves aware of the ways that family members experience stigma and how these experiences might affect families and family member well-being. Participants in 2 studies described the efforts and measures they took to moderate the effects of stigma. Efforts such as challenging misconceptions about substance misuse, challenging public stigma and stereotypes, and challenging the application of stigma to themselves and their family members. Family members may even feel pressure to make difficult choices between the well-being of a family member engaged in substance misuse versus the well-being of the family as a whole. Ambivalence surrounding these difficult choices makes them seem inconsistent as they try to navigate a tortuous path between rocks and hard places. Also in the response repertoire is family members being selectively open with others about the family situation, choosing with care who, when, and how others might be informed. Family members and individuals in treatment for or recovery from substance use disorders may disagree about disclosure to others. Disclosure may be forced on them for reasons of excused absences from school or work, or because their behavior compared to when they previously engaged in substance use is noted by others. Disclosure by pregnant women is particularly sensitive concern. Reactions these individuals and family members experience may have a considerable impact on their psychological and behavioral outcomes, depending on whether the reaction reflects stigma or social support. Perceived or anticipated stigma is a major reason why individuals and family members avoid disclosure. As I explain at the start of every semester to my students in substance misuse courses, they may not have permission from their family members to disclose information about their own or their family members' substance use. Self-disclosure is also family disclosure, so they need to be thoughtful about what they choose to disclose within our learning context. Okay. As a family member stated, there are some people you can talk with and some people you can't. So where do all these concerns I've raised about stigma leave us? Actually, we have available to us a realm of options for addressing substance-related stigma and its aftermath. First, we can enlist approaches for helping to change the person or family affected by stigma. Change the person or family interventions may be incorporated into most forms of evidence-supported and evidence-based treatment related to substance use concerns. For example, cognitive behavior therapy, CBT, interventions, they're designed to help change how a person interprets their experiences as a means of helping them change their behavioral responses. This is an ideal venue for helping a person change self-stigma, their anticipation of stigma, and how they perceive stigma from others. Other therapeutic interventions may help individuals develop counter narratives to the stigmatizing messages and stereotypes they encounter, or may have incorporated into their self-stigma. An interesting study of individuals in recovery from alcohol use disorders identified a distinct difference in the personal narratives shared by individuals comfortably in recovery compared to those struggling in recovery. When their personal narratives contained elements of self-redemption, describing themselves as undergoing a positive personality change, the individuals were almost twice as likely to be comfortably in recovery compared to when their narratives were not redemptive. It's unclear whether overcoming self-stigma and developing narratives that counter stigmatizing stereotypes may have a positive impact on recovery outcomes, or if it's the other way around. In a unique music therapy intervention study, engaging individuals in detoxification care to write blues music song lyrics addressing stigma showed no statistically significant difference in the participants' perceived stigma and social support. However, the therapeutic use of songwriting offered a creative clinical opportunity for individuals to explore the impact of stigma and social support in their lives. Next, we can engage in creative options for changing the environment. Making change in the neighborhood, work or school, social network, support network, healthcare and service delivery systems, mass media, social media, and policies that form the social and physical context where individuals and family members function. We paid attention to language use in the first part of this presentation, and changing the environment and culture related to substance misuse can begin with our efforts to address stigmatizing language ourselves and wherever we might encounter it. And that's personally and professionally. Since about 2013, professional journal editors and professional organizations have begun advocating for non-stigmatizing language related to substance use, including in clinical records, charting practices, and other forms of communication. The White House Office of the National Drug Control Policy published a 2017 memorandum advocating for a shift in all federal departments and agencies to promote use of non-stigmatizing substance-related language. So just how do we practice that behavior? What does that look like? We begin with using person-first language. This means starting with words designating personhood. Words like person, individual, man, woman, child, adolescent, or adult. Qualifiers come after the person-first designation and describe a person's experience or behavior. For example, a person who engages in injection drug use is preferable to labeling them as a drug injector. A person experiencing substance use disorder is preferable to labeling them as an addict. Here are some other examples of person-first language. An adolescent engaged in substance misuse, a man experiencing an alcohol use disorder, or a woman in recovery. Person-first language conveys respect and emphasizes dignity and respect by defining someone as a person, regardless of whatever else is involved. They are first and foremost still a person. So just to test yourself, how might you respond to the label children of alcoholics? How might you revise that label in non-stigmatizing ways? How about describing them as children with a parent who experiences an alcohol use disorder? Fortunately, we have access to some great resources to help us monitor evolving trends in the language we might choose to use. The Dictionary, assembled by the Recovery Research Institute, provides a glossary of substance-related terminology. Not only does the dictionary provide descriptions of terms often encountered in this arena, it presents stigma alerts wherever they're relevant, and it explains why a term's use might be problematic. This example is the term dried drunk. It has a stigma alert, and it explains why that's a problem. The National Institute on Drug Abuse published a handout about reducing stigma through more thoughtful use of language related to substance misuse. Not only does it identify potentially stigmatizing terms, like the dictionary did, it offers alternatives and explains the rationale behind the recommended changes. For example, it explains non-stigmatizing alternatives to the term addicted baby, such as a baby with signs of neonatal withdrawal syndrome, person first, and clinically accurate language. It's worth noting that many clinicians are shifting away from the term neonatal abstinence syndrome to the term neonatal withdrawal syndrome because of stigmatizing behavioral connotations associated with the term abstinence and greater clinical accuracy of the term withdrawal syndrome. It's all evolving all the time. Let's focus for just a moment on a few other potentially problematic terms, starting the word habit. Dictionary synonyms for habit include inclination, proclivity, tendency, and even groove. The word habit suggests that a person could just stop using alcohol or other psychoactive substances if they were so inclined, or simply chooses to do so. A word like habit soft pedals the difficulty of overcoming the powerful and compelling neurobiological and psychological forces that are acting on a person's substance use and possible substance use disorder. This word habit undermines the seriousness and severity of substance use disorders and the effort involved in change attempts and recovery. Another consideration relates to describing a person's drug test results. Clean and dirty are by extension describing the person, not just a test result. Instead, use medical terminology that describes the test, not the person. The test was either negative or positive for substances. This shift in language fits into a paradigm where we move away from and discourage applying a moral failure lens to substance use behavior and replace it with understanding the underlying biopsychosocial forces that are at play. At a policy level, this translates into moving away from punitive and criminal justice responses and promoting treatment, harm reduction, and recovery support responses. Consider too the terms encountered by family members of a person experiencing substance use disorder. The dictionary places a stigma alert on the word codependency, explaining that it tends to pathologize a family member's concern and care about a person engaged in substance use. A label like codependent provokes shame and blame. The term also ignores the reality that a family member may actually be physically, economically, legally, or otherwise situationally reliant on that person. For similar reasons, the term enabling is accompanied by a stigma alert in the dictionary. That term enabler infers blame on the family member for making the individual's condition worse by interrupting naturally occurring negative consequences of substance use. This concept ignores and pathologizes much of what we know about family systems. It's a whole different presentation topic. In short, we can help reduce the experience of stigma for individuals and families with our own careful use of language, and we can have an impact on the broader culture when we work to change how others use language as well. Consider an example my students work with. I have them edit a hypothetical class discussion posting from a hypothetical classmate. First, they identify the problematic words. There are 6 of them. Then they rewrite it using non-stigmatizing language. See if you can identify the 6 problematic words. Here you go. Addicts, pill seekers, alcoholics, substance abusers, pill pushers, and again, addict. So I have them rewrite that using non-stigmatizing language. In another exercise, our students practice ways of talking to others about their stigmatizing language use. Have them respond to a hypothetical scenario where their Uncle Pete explains why he uses so much salad dressing by saying, "What? I'm addicted to it." These exercises take place during the first weeks of the course, and they practice use of non-stigmatizing language in all their work for the rest of the course, with gentle correction when they slip up. A little more on the topic of changing culture through professional education. A team in Canada tested a comprehensive set of tools for providers to reduce stigma. Their toolkit included self-assessment tools for professionals related to stigma, a discussions guide for providers to engage in respectful and inclusive discussions around stigmatized behavior, a stigma reduction toolkit, and an organizational stigma assessment tool for health and social service settings. So the first was about the individuals and the other was about the organizations where they practice. The team reported that training workshops that integrated these resources contributed to professionals' increased awareness of their own internalized, perceived, enacted, structural, and layered forms of stigma, gave them greater comfort in discussing harm reduction and substance use with their clients or patients, and increased their awareness of organizational strategies to reduce individual, interpersonal, community, institutional, and policy levels of stigma. The researchers concluded that providers are motivated to engage in best practices when they are prepared to do so. One organizational or institutional change strategy that we all can engage in relates to promoting the use of non-stigmatizing language in our professional communications, our record keeping, and our charting practices. Additionally, stigma, stereotypes, and attitudes need to be addressed in pre-service education, our undergraduate and graduate students, as well as continuing education efforts. Evidence indicates that social work, nursing, medical, and other professional students come into training with beliefs, stereotypes, and attitudes about individuals who engage in substance misuse, their families, and their prospects for treatment and recovery. These are beliefs and stereotypes that they may very well need to unlearn. As an interesting addition to the literature, professionals providing services to a stigmatized population also sometimes experience associative stigma, in much the same way we saw that family members might. This associative stigma may contribute to professionals' experience of burnout and low job satisfaction. Fortunately, this phenomenon is relatively uncommon. So back to our options. The third choice is we can influence the ways that individuals interact with their environments. We've looked at a few change the person strategies and some with the potential for changing the environment. So let's look at addressing the interplay between person and environment. Therapeutic citizenship. This is a model that both changes individuals and changes social environments. Therapeutic citizenship is essentially about becoming an advocate for change, serving as a representative of a stigmatized group who can challenge stereotypical and stigmatizing beliefs and attitudes from the strength of being a positive example. Therapeutic citizenship, on one hand, can offer an individual a sort of redemption from their prior spoiled identity, replacing it with a valorized social identity and restore their self-esteem. Engaging in therapeutic citizenship helps internalize a recovery identity, supports reframing and reconceptualizing the past as a sort of empowerment and meaning as well. It provides social networking opportunities within a recovery support community. Some recovery programs emphasize altruism and service, and within a stages of change model, this type of activity, this therapeutic citizenship activity, is often associated with recovery maintenance. Thus, engaging in public advocacy and efforts to create more responsive recovery support systems for others has potential therapeutic value for the individual, and at the same time helps change environments on their own and others' behalf. As a caution, individuals in one study did identify a potential harm that they might set themselves up to experience additional stigma and discrimination, that advocacy activities may interfere with their ability to engage in self-care, and that benefits may not outweigh personal costs or harms. So it has to be entered into thoughtfully. Aside from the plentiful evidence that peer recovery support can have significant positive impact on recovery outcomes, consider the potential of exposure to individuals who are flourishing as a means of challenging prevailing public, professional, and self-stigmatizing stereotypes. Stereotypes and prejudicial responses that we might challenge in this way include recklessness, unreliability, inadequacy, and threat stereotypes. Peer counselors can present alternative images, the opposite to each of these stereotypes, and can draw a very different response set, replacing responses of anger, pity, and dread with respect. They portray substance use disorders as treatable and reinforce the message that recovery happens. Evidence exists that portraying substance use disorders as treatable improves public attitudes and reduces stigma related to substance misuse. Investigators in one study concluded that portrayal of persons with successfully treated substance use disorders is a promising strategy for reducing stigma and discrimination, as well as improving public perceptions of treatment effectiveness, which in turn influence policy favoring recovery support services. So in summary, what did we address in this presentation? That stigma is a common experience for individuals engaged in substance misuse, treatment, and recovery, as well as for their families. That their experience of public, professional, and self-stigma negatively impacts help-seeking and recovery efforts. That the language we use can be stigmatizing. We advocate for non-stigmatizing language use, and when we slip up in practicing these new skills, we need to practice forgiveness and learn from our mistakes. We identified some strategies and resources for addressing stigma and reducing its negative impact, promoting change with individuals, their families, communities, organizations, institutions, and policies. As professionals and concerned community members, from our very first outreach and engagement encounters, through screening, assessment, treatment intervention, recovery support, preventive interventions, and even our policies and practice environments, it's important to consider not only how we might inadvertently communicate stigma about substance misuse and people experiencing substance use disorders, but also our responsibility to advocate for and respect their inherent dignity. Recommended actions we can take include educating others in the general public and among professionals about substance misuse, evidence-supported treatment, that treatment works and recovery happens, and about stigma. And we can use language with care, communicate the personhood of individuals who engage in substance misuse and their family members, and respect their inherent dignity and personhood. In the language of recovery support, the message is that I am still a person. Here is an acknowledgement that the Council on Social Work Education has funded part of the work that was presented here today in a practitioner education project. Again, thanking the Michigan Nurses Association. And what Larissa mentioned earlier, I don't have any of the conflict of interest concerns that might arise. Thank you.
Dr. Begun, thanks.
Yes.
Now let's go, there were some questions here.
Thank you, Brandon.
Yeah, let me go back and see how we can bring some of these up. First, just a matter of administrivia kind of thing. Somebody asked, at one point we talked about folks being able to submit the Michigan Nurses Association social workers submitting that certificate for perhaps social work. Larissa, did anything come about as a result of that? I know that oftentimes social work entities will honor your certificate.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. We didn't have enough time to process that with our accrediting agencies. So we will be pursuing that in the future. So please do check back with M&A for social work credits as well. But for tonight, we weren't able to complete that.
Okay. You want to address the recording being shared? We intend on doing that. So.
Yep. So with Dr. Begun's permission and with her parameters, Michigan Nurses Association will host this as a CE offering on our website. So please do check minurses.org for more information.
We've got another question here. I'll read it and then whoever, Dr. Begun. I know that stigma can also play a role in what types of treatment options are offered through drug courts, judges, and biases against MAT. What are some ways to educate and change perceptions in this area?
That's an important question. So, and it's true of a number of different kinds of interventions. So, for example, some people have stigma against 12-step programs. This is something that I think we need to work with within our professions to help them understand that we need a continuum of services and a continuum of interventions, that medication-assisted interventions are being heavily supported by evidence. And so this, I think, it's important to do a lot of training and retraining of the stigma and biases about different kinds of treatment among our professionals, but also how a lot of that gets presented to the public. And as you mentioned, drug courts, how do we help judges and how do we help the people who are evaluating drug court participants? So I think a lot of it is about educating about what's the evidence say about these different interventions.
Yeah, I can tell you how our co-founder, Judge Linda Davis, addresses it. Addiction personally affected her life and her family. And she, just the way she approaches it, or she retired recently, but the way she approached it in her court was not in a way that provided any stigma. So, I think that one of the things we can do is to share our stories. And that's one thing I miss about our meetings at the 242 Community Church, was we literally give the microphone to anybody who wants to stand up. And I'm not talking about 5 minutes, but I'm Audrey Begun. The reason I'm here is this is something that I'm passionate about. It's affected my family, and I'm excited about being able to make a difference. And just by sharing our stories is huge. And I know that Judge Davis does that at her, before she retired, in her sobriety court. So let me get to another question here. And I don't think you guys can see these, but David Gordon, Dr. David Gordon asked this question: is stigma too monolithic and inextricable to defeat? If so, are there more practical, effective strategies to cope with it? The anecdote provided by you, Dr. Begun, about the swimmer trying but failing to defeat the tide versus the surfer who learns to harness it. You understand that question?
Mm-hmm. I think I do. So going back to anecdotes, thinking about the one where I shared what happened with the woman who was incarcerated, and thinking about how her self-stigma was really defeating her, and how just reframing it, just thinking about it a little bit differently, changed her whole attitude about moving forward and thinking about hope and thinking about possibility and potential. We can do that at the individual level. We can do that at organizational levels. We can do that even in policy. You know, it's one of those things, yes, it's big and it's monolithic, but we need to chip away at it. And eventually, enough of us chipping away at it in enough places, I think is going to change the world.
I actually agree with that. This is such a huge problem in terms of people who are suffering from the disease in terms of getting care, that we have to chip away at it, because it's not going to get any better. So, you know, Dr. Gordon had another question. It's quite lengthy. Is it more healthy to own it as your negative past as the impetus to eliminate it in the future and then help others to do likewise? For instance, is it not an initial and necessary step for 12-step programs to accept and identify with the label in order to move forward? That was one question. Are we spinning wheels to try to use political correctness as a cudgel to shame people using what is to them conventional terms and re-educating, redefining with more politically correct terms? At the same time, are we wasting time and resources that could be much better employed elsewhere?
Well, again, I think that, every big change starts with small steps, and that if enough of us are making those small steps, we can make a bigger impact. I think that, yes, that we all need to be able to recognize when we are either feeling stigma or when we are expressing it, and thinking about it, not just in terms of language, but going back to that explicit and implicit stigma, because they're very different. The explicit, all of us would probably say, no, I don't do that. But think about the implicit things, just in terms of how do we look at somebody? How do we furnish a clinic? Do we use beaten up, bratty, old, nasty furniture, or do we treat the people coming into our clinic with enough respect to have it painted nicely? And do you see what I'm getting at? So just how do we treat them with respect and that inherent dignity across the board in all of our explicit and implicit ways? Those are all really important messages to convey. So yeah, I think we do all need to, recognize it when we're doing it, but we can't all do that. It's hard. It's hard. I slip up. I need people to point it out to me. I try to point it out very gently. So again, that shame and blame, I try to point it out to my students in gentle ways, or to my colleagues in gentle ways. I tell them, through an anecdote or through a story, rather than saying, what are you doing? Look at what you're doing. I try not to shame them and blame them. We all make mistakes. We need to forgive ourselves when we slip up and recognize it and try to do better.
Yeah,
I think that's the best we can hope for.
We've got some other questions here that they're really good. From Dylan Lundgren, aside from an individual suffering from sociopathies, et cetera, behaviors that go against one's own values, for example, breaking the law, risky behavior, will we create feelings of shame, guilt, et cetera? How can we help individuals to discern between the internal effects of one's actions and the external effects of stigma? So, do you have any suggestions for how to practice discernment? For example, not approving of destructive behavior toward oneself. It's switching on me. Hang on, people are asking questions and I'm trying to keep up. Example, approving of destructive behavior toward oneself or others without destigmatizing. So I don't know if
So the best I can understand that question, I would go back to some basic child rearing practices that we encourage people to use, which is you point out the problem of a behavior, you don't problematize a person. So it's like, I don't like the behavior you're doing, or I don't feel that what you're doing is safe, is very different than identifying the person as being problematic.
Okay.
Okay.
This next one, I have, I just personally dealt with this question that Fiona asks from Michigan Medicine. Audrey, do you have any suggestions for how we might label hospital-based services teams that are supporting patients with substance use disorder issues? I worry that calling it an SUD service or worse, addiction service may both push patients away, but I am curious what ideas you might have about naming such a service in a non-stigmatizing way. Doesn't this sound where I asked you for help?
Absolutely.
Okay, just to give everybody, I'm not going to say the name of the practice, but Audrey and I received a brochure on to evaluate for stigma. Actually, I got it and I said, hey, Audrey, will you help me out? And Audrey did what Fiona is asking for this practice. And I'll tell you, thank goodness I did it, because she broke it down in a way that made a whole lot of sense. And instead of medically assisted treatment, you suggested, Audrey, medically assisted therapy, wasn't it? Or do I have it reversed?
Well, they were mixing up the terms treatment and therapy. Actually, I think I went a little bit further out on the limb with that one. And this is what I would suggest to this person, is that maybe just totally reframing it from what's the problem, which is SUD, substance use disorder, and not including that in your label at all, but thinking about it in terms of what are you trying to promote, which is recovery. So using language that's in the recovery support kind of world. So thinking about it in terms of we're a recovery support service. We are providing services that support your recovery efforts. Do you see how that's very different than saying we're providing, any kind of specific therapy or treatment? And it's not about the problem. It's about where we're trying to get to.
Exactly.
It's a positive reframing of what the goals of that agency, program, whatever is.
Far be it from a professor from Ohio State to help U of M, but if needed, maybe I'll hook you up. Fiona's awesome, and she's always in it to do better.
Yeah.
And
and that goes back to what I said in the presentation, is that we know that professionals want to do better.
Yeah.
They just aren't provided the tools to do it.
That's
and so
right.
I was digging up, when I was preparing the presentation, digging up a lot of resources that are out there that I never knew were there until I started preparing for this presentation. It's really cool what is out there. It's just not front and center.
I'll add this too, as is the case with many complex problems, and this one is pretty complex. In my experience at solving complex problems over the course of now this is business, not healthcare. It comes root cause corrective action typically gets back to education. I don't care if it's a stamping machine that's not making out a part right, or addressing stigma in ER at St. Joe in Ipsy, or at Michigan Medicine in Ann Arbor. So in addition to properly addressing these things topically, recovery, you said, instead of calling it whatever, substance use disorder, we're here to help people recover. Okay, there has to be education, because I will tell you that when FAN has people, when we get calls, and I took this call personally from a young man who was entered into an ER, and he was seeking help. He was suffering withdrawals, and the person in ER put him behind. Well, first problem was that he was forced to wait because his condition wasn't acute enough. Well, I've never suffered from heroin withdrawals or alcohol withdrawals, but based on what people tell me, it ain't pretty. That person is acutely ill and needs to go back behind that curtain, just like someone with a major laceration. Just again, I'm just telling you what this young man communicated to me. Then when he went back behind the curtain, somebody came in to assess him. They went to go talk, and he could overhear them saying, "We got Joe here who's been here 3 times in the last month. He's, got withdrawals from drinking too much. What do you want to do?" This is something that is only, that sort of language has to be addressed through education. And, it's just, I don't know, just a personal observation. I want to get back to these questions. Care providers struggle to ascertain accurate social histories, specifically alcohol, illicits, and misuse of opioids. Any thoughts on how to address this difficult subject? With alcohol, many say double, quote, double whatever they say they drink, unquote. Is that more of a medical question or a Audrey Begun?
No, I mean, just that in itself is heavily embedded in stigma. I mean, it's just assuming right off the bat that these people are not going to be truthful, that they're going to lie to us. I think that learning other ways of asking the questions, learning other ways of collecting the information and the data, we really promote motivational interviewing style kinds of questions, and just working at it very, very differently than coming at it from a very sort of hierarchical, judgmental way. And again, facing the reality that folks that are trying to do this are usually under a lot of pressure, time, those kinds of things. But thinking about it from maybe some interdisciplinary teams, social workers tend to approach these things differently than medical people, because the pressures are different and their skills are different and their training is different. So thinking about it maybe in a more interdisciplinary way, but just that assumption kind of statement really reinforces some of the stigma about people being untruthful and unreliable and that kind of thing. So yeah, I would work on learning some other skills for getting information.
Courts and CPSs often want to know how long the patient should be on MOUDs. Many times the patient will tell them they are supposed to be on it for the remainder of their lives. What is the recommendation for time frame to be on MOUDs? Does it depend on the patient and their history?
I don't know the answer to that.
Okay. During your presentation, you mentioned tonight while discussing enablers and family shame and stigma as a, quote, whole other topic, unquote. Can you come back and talk more about that? I don't know if they meant come back and have another presentation about it.
Right. What I was getting at is the whole concept of family systems theory and how family systems are changed and how family systems respond to change in individuals. And that was what I was getting at, is that is a whole other topic. And yeah, that's certainly something we could talk about. Maybe.
Yeah, I will tell you, just to relay a quick personal story. When we were trying to open up our yoga for recovery classes, I was going out and knocking on doors in the community to get a donor, bricks and mortar, to hold our classes. So I went to this place. It was a local church, and I went in there with another advisory board member from FAN, and they asked us to come and present what we needed it for. So I went in, I shared my story, I shared my son's story, and they said, okay, if you go out there, go in the vestibule area and we'll come out and let you know what we decide. So while I was out there, this elderly man came out and he shook my hand and he said, thank you for this. Thank you for everything you're doing. And I wanted you to know my son had an addiction and he's now okay. And I have 2 grandkids now. And I said, hey, you got to get back in there and share that. Audrey, you know what he told me? I can't do that. I can't do it because I don't want them to think I'm a lousy parent.
That's
And
right.
what I want to tell everyone here, don't get caught up in that. I go out and talk about my son. You all need to go out and talk about and share your stories about your sons, your daughters, your aunts, your uncles, your cousins, your friends, the police officers you know who are struggling with this disease, the teachers, the judges, everybody. We are all connected through this insidious disease. Start sharing your story and not, Audrey, why don't you go ahead?
But the only caveat I would give to that, Mario, is that we need to have the permission of our family members to do that.
Yes.
Because by disclosing about ourselves, we're often disclosing about the other people in our lives, and that's not fair to get them
Yep.
sandbagged by.
And I'm not advocating sharing someone's story who's not. I will tell you, my son is dead, and I'm going to leverage his death to try to help other people battle this insidious disease.
And
So
that's been very powerful.
yep, and so, but you are correct. You are correct. So let me keep going. A good book. You got a good book, Audrey, that you'd recommend on this topic?
I haven't found a book. That doesn't mean one doesn't exist. You saw that long, I had Brandon scroll through that long reference list. There were a lot of articles. There were a lot of, there's a couple of book chapters. I think there's a book chapter about changing to sort of recovery support thinking from what we were talking about with, the problem, substance use disorders, that kind of stuff, to recovery support thinking. There's a good chapter that's been written about that. So I would really look for things that are about that kind of, new way of thinking about things. And there's things on the web, there's things on the internet, there's articles. But I would really be starting to look at that side, which is that reframe, that positive reframe of looking at recovery support language and recovery support services as sort of a new way of framing what we do, rather than framing it within that sort of pathology way of looking at things.
Matt, something like addiction, Matt, recovery support services. I really like that.
Yeah, that's sort of where I would go if I were trying to start to change how I thought about things and how other people think about things.
And what I'll do for Laura, who asked that question, Laura Lavender, I'll try to do some additional digging on that to see if there's anything out there. Well, actually, I don't know if the person that asked about the book was anonymous. I meant to address, I'm going to do some research and see what I can come up with to the anonymous person who asked that question. Dylan says, thanks for answering this question. It was great. Laura asks, how do I educate someone who is not familiar with the language and or lifestyle of people that are in recovery or are not in recovery, but in the midst of abuse, i.e. dope fiend, crackhead, etc.? Great question.
I think it's about talking with them about, this is what we think, this is why we think it. Using anecdotes like the one about the woman who was incarcerated, to think about people as people and not as, whatever their label is or whatever. But to really see them, and this is why the stories about your son are so powerful, is because this is about a real person that you can hang your ideas on. And part of the problem with stigma is that the people are personalized, and so these anecdotes and these stories personalize it, and they make you see the exceptions, and they make you see that, like I said, recovery does happen, and there are positive things changes that people are able to make.
Okay. Harry, I know Harry, he's wonderful. Please tell me how I can view this presentation again and learn the terminology and meaning. I personally was very self-deprecating as of 2.5 years ago. My doctor checked me on that immediately, and I have been in cognitive behavioral therapy ever since and can continue.
Well, those two resources I think are really, really helpful. The dictionary and then the one from NIDA that I mentioned. Those two, we could pull the links out maybe and get those out there. The presentation itself, I think in a few days we will be able to post the presentation. It will also eventually be a presentation, most of the same content provided by the Council on Social Work Education, but that's not quite ready yet. But I think what I understood was that we would have this presentation ready in a few days to share. And that might help the person who is looking for some other resources, because they can then scroll through it very slowly and look at that reference list and see if there's something that strikes their fancy.
Awesome. And Larissa will talk about that. It'll be, as soon as we edit it, you get the requisite permission, it'll be up there. So Harry, you'll be able to see this again on the Michigan Nurses Association website. We've got a very interesting comment from an anonymous participant. The words said affect families. When a pastor at my church found out my son had a substance use disorder, she said, quote, "You must feel so guilty," unquote. I would like to see more support for families as well. It hurts.
Yeah.
I mean,
Families are victims of the stigma too. They are categorized, they're labeled, they're diagnosed. There's just all kinds of what was that, associative stigma, and I think that's something that maybe as professionals we maybe are a little under aware of, and so raising awareness that these kinds of things are stigmatizing to the family members, which then have all the same kinds of impact, self-blame, self-doubt, wanting to run away and hide and retreat. None of that is helpful to families, in terms of supporting them.
Yeah, I will tell you, all of you, I forget the name of the acting Surgeon General for the United States. He's in the military. If somebody puts his name in the comment section, he's awesome. Okay. And I'll never forget this. About 1.5 years ago, I read something he put out on Twitter or Facebook. I can't remember which social media platform it was, but Jerome Adams is his name. Just light bulb popped off in my head. Amazing guy. And he said, I want everybody to know that, and this, he was specifically addressing this to parents, that addiction is in my family. My brother, it was somebody in his family was battling a substance use disorder. And I am the acting Surgeon General for the United States. My mom raised us both. My mom didn't do anything more right with me than she did with my brother. Parents, don't fret about this. And this is not a Jerome Adams quote, but it was words to that effect. And whoever typed that in anonymously, I don't know who you are, but if you want to reach out to me at Washtenaw Fan, I'll tell you what I do. And to the person that asked about how do we educate, and when people are using those words, I will tell you, I meet it head on with people. I was talking with a physician who said, I had an addict come in, and the other guy, whoa. You didn't have an addict come in. You had someone who's suffering from a disease, and that disease is called substance misuse. And if you're going to try to help build that person the bridge from where they are to seeking treatment, got to watch the words you use. Mm-hmm. Now, let's continue on. How can I help you? And I don't waste time, Audrey, but I don't know. I'm get in people's.
We all need to calling it out when we see it, but again, thinking about, well, our audience, what can our audience take and how can we present it to that audience? And, so like I said, with my students, a lot of them are undergraduates and, they're used to these kind of, that very flippant, oh, I'm just addicted to nail polish, or I'm just addicted to this, game, whatever, or even the advertising that says, the new most addictive game that you can play on the internet. Why is that a good thing? So what happens when we use that word so flippantly and so carelessly, and so, it cheapens what the whole experience is. And so that exercise of, how do you talk to Uncle Pete, practicing, how do you talk to Uncle Pete about talking about his salad dressing addiction? It gives them some skills so that when they do run into it and their friends say, I'm addicted to, whatever music or something like that, that they can actually, they've practiced the skills. That might be helpful to all of us. These are skills we have to practice. It's not easy to confront somebody when we hear it, and to do it in a way that might be effective. And so they see each other's postings, and so trying it with some colleagues or some friends or other people, just to see, well, what would you do? Well, how would you react if I said this to you? These are skills we need to practice. How do we help correct people and inform people? Those are skills we have to practice.
No doubt about it. We're going to have to, I'm going to have to turn it over to Larissa in very short order because she's got some administrative type stuff to do, but I do want to read this. Harry says, I'm learning to be proud, if that's the right word, to speak of my long addictions and recovery, especially the support, re-education, and the continuing support of a new friend in WFAN. I think that's us, Washtenaw fan. Harry, the right word is proud. So you keep up the good work in your recovery. I will, Brandon, got a question for you. There was some good people putting up stuff over here, resources. Is there a way to memorialize that, the chat feature, what's in there, so that if anything, you can get to that, Brandon?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, awesome. Just make sure there's a copy of that. I'm going to finish with this last thing that Dylan typed up. An individual comes back to treatment for the 5th time. He has experienced a substance misuse challenge. He starts to lie and deceive immediately and continues despite motivational interviewing. Dishonesty is a trait strongly correlated with substance misuse challenges. This has a negative effect on the treatment culture and his peers. He shows very little interest to change. And I would suggest he is, quote, not ready, unquote. I would suggest this based on 16 years as a professional and a person in long-term recovery. It seems an appropriate judgment to suggest this individual needs a more significant motivator than another stay in treatment. In fact, I would consider this a destructive relationship. However, this could be misconstrued as stigma rather than discernment. Do you see any problem with that? Does that make sense to you? I know it was long, Audrey.
I understand where this person's coming from. And I understand, I think that this is maybe somebody who asked before about, resources and that kind of thing. I go back to, I had some training from Carlo Di Clemente, who is one of the originators of the trans-theoretical model of behavior change. And all of the evidence that suggests that for people to change, for example, smoking behavior, it takes on average 5 to 6 serious change attempts to succeed. So what I think about in terms of other substances is maybe it's naive for us to think that a person is going to be able to change in 1 attempt or 2 attempts or even 4 or 5 attempts. And so to me, I never know which attempt is going to be the one. So I just have to treat all of the possible attempts as possibly being the one, and the one that's going to make the difference. Because I do think there's some things that are cumulative. And so I think about, well, how do we handle the past failures in terms of building towards a positive outcome? And these are just different philosophies and different skills. And, I am sensitive to the fact that there are resource issues. But I also believe that maybe this will be the one time that makes the difference.
Okay. You guys, I need to turn it over to Larissa so that she can make sure the nurses that are out there can apply for the credit. We're going to make sure, I'm going to make sure, and we are going to make sure that anybody that was left with a question unanswered, that I'll reach back out to folks. Again, reach out to Fan. I see your questions. I'll be following up. There's questions here that we didn't get to, Audrey, and that's okay. But Larissa, why don't you go ahead and do your thing?
Well, thanks again to Mario and to Dr. Begun, and certainly to Brandon for his help today as well. And again, I appreciate the partnership, which just goes to prove that you can build new relationships in a virtual world. And that's what, we were able to do tonight. So thanks for the connections and for everybody who attended. Again, we're doing this also on behalf of the Michigan Nurses Foundation to support all healthcare workers in their own recovery so that we can get them back into the workforce. And for that link, if you just scroll up a little bit in the chat, that was, I believe, the first thing posted tonight. We really appreciate your support, and that's a very easy way to ensure that 100% of those donations go right back to healthcare workers. For our nurses attending tonight, to finish out your continuing education credit, that's also a link in the chat tonight. And if you can't see the chat right now, just use your mouse and go to the bottom of your screen, usually to where your Zoom toolbar will appear. And one of the options is chat. Click on that and the chat will appear. So if you don't have that open, that's where these links are housed. And the link there is for the continuing education link, which will also be available on our website. If you have any problems with that link or finishing the evaluation again, which is very short, feel free to just drop us a line at minurses.org. That's our website. And we really appreciate your support, not only for the foundation, but just your support of this topic being such an important one for healthcare providers to become more skilled with and to be that bridge between so many of us who are struggling with verbiage and language. And I really appreciated what the evaluation is going to ask you for. One thing that you learned tonight, and one thing that I learned was that we're not very good at educating, especially healthcare professionals, perhaps, in this language and in these approaches. So as an educator, a big part of my heart is with nursing education, and I kind of revow to help my fellow colleagues out with that. So thank you again for the connections and for the opportunity from the Michigan Nurses Association. And any questions, please let us know. Well, thank you so much to Washtenaw Families Against Narcotics and everyone who has supported this partnership. I'm so excited to bring this as kind of a joint effort to all of our families and friends of folks with substance misuse. And nurses are not immune to substance misuse either. So I was so proud to be a part of this topic. The Michigan Nurses Association is the largest representative body for registered nurses in Michigan. So that's our life's work, is to support nurses no matter where they're at in their practice. The Michigan Nurses Foundation also is connected to the Michigan Nurses Association. And part of what we're doing tonight is we are asking if you will help us support nurses in recovery through the Michigan Nurses Foundation. And that foundation supports all healthcare workers with a fund that's dedicated to substance misuse and recovery as nurses regain their practice and all healthcare workers return to the workforce. So we feel that that's just incredibly important work. We're excited to bring more light to this topic through what we do, and certainly through Dr. Begun's presentation tonight. At the end of the evening tonight, you'll be receiving, if you're a registered nurse, continuing education credit for this session. It's a free CE, and all you'll have to do for that is just to stay on the line here in our Zoom session. And in the chat box over on the side of your screen, you'll see a link pop up. And by clicking on the link, you'll be completing a very brief evaluation of tonight's session that will take you to the continuing education or CE field. As soon as you complete that link, which again is super brief, it should take about 30 seconds, I think, your continuing education certificate will be automatically emailed to you. So please look for that link towards the end of the presentation. I'll be happy to answer any questions when we get to that point. As Dr. Begun is introduced, I would just like to let her know that I appreciate her allowing me to be with her tonight as well. And we worked with Dr. Begun, and both the Michigan Nurses Association and Dr. Begun have no conflicts of interest tonight and no other financial interest to disclose. So that's just a required piece we are supposed to say. So with that, I'll definitely turn it back over to Mario and Dr. Begun, and thank you so much for this opportunity, and I'm looking forward to it as well.